All right, Project Herpetoculture podcast returning after a little break of 2 weeks with episode 43.
Go.
And before I introduce our guests, I'm going to go through our standard housekeeping spiel and give a shout out to Dylan and the Animals at Home Network for hosting us.
Go.
Although we've been called out about that by one Dr. Crawdad who says that there are some people in this game who've been doing things a lot longer. So there's some competition for GOAT status.
Oh, I mean, fine.
There's a shot across the bow. I want to acknowledge it publicly.
Wait, you mean greatest of all time podcaster?
Yeah.
Whatever.
In the hope space.
Okay. I mean, Dylan can be the GOAT in my world.
There you go. You're still the GOAT to ask Dylan.
Yeah.
Anyway, and also want to give a shout out to Charlie for editing our audio and keeping us on the rails here. Check him out at Make Luck Marketing for any social media marketing kind of stuff. He's a wizard with that. And I also want to acknowledge our sponsors. So we have Custom Reptile Habitats who've been with us since the outset of this little project of ours. And we have an affiliate code for them posted in our description where if you make a purchase through that, we'll get a little kickback and at no additional cost to you. That'll help us keep the lights on here. We also have Redline Shipping for all your reptile shipping needs. And last but not least, we have Cold Blooded Caffeine, who roast really awesome coffee from all over the place and donate some of the proceeds from that to conservation in some areas that hosts amazing herpetofauna. So,
delicious coffee.
Yeah, it's really good. We also have our own Project Herpetoculture label coffee with them, which is delicious. Highly recommended for those who like light fabric and coffees.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to support the show directly, we've got a Patreon and we've got our merch with some cool shirts and mugs. The most recent design making fun of Phil a little bit in a very loving manner, of course. And check it all out on projectherp.com. With all that out of the way, I am very stoked to introduce our guest, and that is Jamie Woods. Jamie, thanks for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Oh
yeah, pleasure, man. So you and I first became acquainted just through some messages on social media and all that, and it seemed pretty obvious right away that we would have a really awesome discussion on here. So I'm grateful for you taking the time to join us. And before we kind of just dive into like our main conversation, I want to start with just the softball stuff, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your background in herpetoculture, aquaculture, animal culturing, and that whole world for you. So yeah, take it away.
All right. Well, it works out well because the fish and the reptiles are basically interconnected. So I was thinking about this today. I knew I was coming to the podcast. Everyone gets asked the same question at first. And, the first thing, the earliest memory I have as a kid, I think I was 4 going on 5. And for Christmas, remember I came out into the garage and my parents were there. And my parents, my dad was holding something. I walk in and he said, "Hey, this is for you." And it was a little Honduran milk snake. Oh. And so it's like burned in my brain. And I was so little, I wasn't scared of it. But, at the time, you're not really comfortable with it. And he said, "It's not going to bite you. It'll be okay." And I held it. And I remember thinking it's like a switch flipped. You know what I mean? And so that kind of started out with reptiles. My dad growing up had tons of reptiles throughout his entire life. He kept reptiles from long before I was here. And he passed away a couple of years ago, and he was breeding dart frogs all the way to the point where he died. So, they were always a part of our life. We went to Daytona, the reptile show. At the time, it was in Orlando, starting in '96. And I think we missed 3 years total. So I've been to 27 Daytona reptile shows at this point. Again, the first couple I went to were in Orlando. But so while we were doing the reptiles, my parents separated, and my mom was scared of snakes. And she basically said, "I'm sorry, you got to keep those at your dad's," and I was really into other exotic pets like birds and fish. And so she basically said, kind of as a peace treaty, "If you keep the reptiles of your dad, I'll let you have as many fish tanks as you want." And, hearing those words, I was like, all right, sweet. So I started in on the fish as well. I did that as a hobby, was breeding them till about age 14. And then I started working at an aquarium store that was exclusively fish. Like no birds, no cats, no dogs. It was just freshwater on one side, saltwater on the other. And so that kind of just like fueled the hobby. So probably the next 10-ish years, I focused primarily on fish while simultaneously helping my dad with his collection. My dad's collection of reptiles was primarily chameleons, dart frogs, and North American colubrids. My general interest since I was little has been arboreal snakes. Like it's one of those things. Like I can remember being at Orlando, and it was in this Radisson hotel, and it was like 2 rooms. And I remember walking in this room, and I think it was Greg Maxwell, who's a famous green tree python breeder, but I don't know for sure. It might have. I was so little at the time, everything's like blinding, but I can distinctly remember green tree pythons, the yellow babies and red babies, being in these little containers, right? And it stuck with me for literally decades. But I digress. So back to the fish. So I was doing freshwater and saltwater. I bred tons of freshwater fish. I also have actually been successful breeding saltwater fish. I've bred a couple clownfish species and actually raised them to the point where they were babies, which, as we can discuss, is significantly harder than when your fish are microscopic. You have to have food that's smaller than them, so it kind of creates an issue. But I've also been a part of aquaculturing a lot of corals for the hobby. We were importing things, exporting things. So I've kind of I was around reptiles even when I was not heavily into them, while simultaneously being heavy into the fish. And then I went to school in University of Florida, and I kind of had to get out of the aquariums, because moving aquariums, like we think of moving reptiles as hard, but moving aquariums is damn near impossible. So especially saltwater ones, because when you break them down and you put them back up, there's this ammonia spike. We can talk about all that later. But I transitioned, and I'm going to Daytona every single year, and it was always a joke with my dad and I, like, what are we going to buy? What are we going to buy? Finally cracked when I was, I guess, like a junior in college, and bought a Woma python.
Nice.
It was the first snake that I had had in years. And it was like, holy shit, this is the coolest thing in the whole world. You know what I mean? So I had that Woma for about 4 years. And then unfortunately I had to move. And luckily for me, I developed a good amount of friends who were in the reptile hobby in Gainesville, where I went to school. I gave the Woma away. I came down to South Florida, wasn't keeping anything again. And then during COVID, I actually had enough time, we're inside 24 hours a day, where I said, you know what, I'm going to do green tree pythons. I've loved them literally since I was 5 years old, and the first one I ever saw. So I snagged some green trees. I worked with them for a few years, and I kind of just gotten the ones that I could find at the time. They weren't like locality specimens. And over time, I realized I wanted the species I like to work with generally locality based, because in green trees, there's a lot of variety. The 2 that I had at the time were both really, really, really nice designer animals. One in particular was extremely nice, and designer is code word in the green tree hobby for hybrids. So I decided, I mean, that's what it is. It is.
Yeah.
But so I decided those 2 needed to go to people who were going to use them in designer projects and would be able to actually, they were great examples, and I don't want them to sit here and rot when I'm not necessarily into them as much. So I parted with those. I was doing Corallus, like emerald tree boas. But at the time, I started with annulateds and Russian burgeri, the black-tailed tree boas, and I had some of those. And I had Sanzinia, the Madagascan tree boas. And I had a good collection of those. And I decided that, again, to be perfectly honest, I got in and said, I've loved these since I was little, but they're just not what I'm looking for in terms of keeping. So I made sure those went to people who are going to do good work with them. And so now at this point, people listening won't be able to see, but I got a couple empty enclosures, and I decided it's time for me to take a step back, stop playing, jumping jacks with them or just moving around. It's time to figure out exactly what I want to do moving forward and go from there. So that's kind of my background up to this point. The only thing I didn't mention is, like I said, my dad was breeding dart frogs. I've been breeding dart frogs for a long time. So ironically, I have not bred a reptile. I have bred dart frogs, which some people think are probably harder than reptiles, but it just it works out that way sometimes.
Yeah, I think people have I know I've made this comparison on the show before, but between herpetoculturists and artists, like artists, illustrators, and painters, how some folks seem to kind of latch on to one particular vein of things, right? Like you have some artists who they're incredible portrait and character designers. They just have a knack for that. There's some kind of weird propensity for them there. You have some people who are sort of more inclined towards industrial design and architecture. You get some individuals who maybe are, like both, right? Where they're like a Craig Mullins type who seem like they can do everything, right? But I feel like that's the same thing in reptiles, because like if you try to give me a plant, not good, wrong. That is the wrong decision. Like I have the opposite of a green thumb. I don't even know. Right. So I think there's, I don't know. I just think it's one of those things where like some folks kind of have propensities towards one thing or another. And, maybe for you, because of the familiarity with it, as of yet, dart frogs have been more of what just, sticks. So I just feel like some stuff just sticks. You know what I'm saying?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's hard too, because, it's unusual when someone has the ability to do something well, but it's not something they necessarily want to do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people have a tendency to latch onto the things they're good at and say, this is my thing because I am good at it, but I found that the way I kept dart frogs was actually more similar to fish, which is why I think I had success with them, even though they weren't necessarily my go-to animal. I'll be honest with everyone. I am full blown a snake person. I love lizards. I always think I'm going to do them. And then, I buy a book, I read about it, and I say, okay, this ain't for me. So it's just, it kind of is always how it works. I got like every lizard book that Edition Chimera has released in the last 10 years. I've got over there and I read them over and over. Like I have this one on lizards of the Malay Archipelago or Peninsula, whatever it is. Great book. But every time I look at it, I'm like, this is awesome. But what am I supposed? I don't know what to do with these things. I have no clue. I have no idea how to set them up. I'm like, so it just is how it works. But I think you're right. There's a tendency to kind of pick your lane, or some people are more broad. But again, I think the reason I had success with dart frogs was almost certainly because you can keep them very similar to the way you keep fish. And we can talk about, obviously that more, but I think it made an easy transition, and it's not surprising. So one of the guys who's extremely famous in the fish world is a guy named Jack Wadley, and he introduced what are called discus. They call him the king of the aquarium. They're these big, beautiful freshwater fish. He's pretty much the godfather in the U.S. Like he was literally hiring planes. He was out of Miami. His facility is still down there, and there's a new owner because Wadley passed away. But from what I understand, in Wadley's last decade or so, he was breeding Ophaga lamani and a bunch of other dart frogs. So I think it's much closer than people think.
Yeah. That's really cool.
That's really weird. I was also sorry, Roy, I'm not trying to cut you off there. I know you were saying something too, but I also feel kind of intrigued by this whole strange, I feel like, so I've heard about this in other contexts. I've done a lot of reading on the idea around talent and like if talent is real and sort of if so, what is it and how does it, what is that? And my interest in it was related to art at the time, and then also related to jujitsu, because do you have to be talented to be phenomenally successful in jujitsu? Like probably. And oh shit, I totally lost my train of thought there. Oh yes. Now, okay. So, one thing that there was one book, I don't remember which of the several that I was reading that talked about this, but this idea of ignition, because, one of the distinguishing factors for a lot of people in terms of, what sort of separates one person from another and sort of a successful person from another in any given field is longevity and endurance and sticking with something for, because the reality is that the majority of people who pick up any particular hobby or pursuit, they usually give up. It's the rarer person that sticks with something for longer than 6 months, And so like, what is this quality, and why is it that some are able to stick it out, see it through, because, you know, and you know, it's like, oh, is it passion? Is it passion? And it's like, no, it like passion doesn't really seem to cover all the bases, because passion is, by definition, it's like, it's fleeting, it's intense, it's like a shooting star, it burns bright, but for 5 seconds, right? But then, you know, there's this thing around ignition, and the fact that if you have this sufficient ignition, that can kind of carry you through this sort of dedication, this momentum that can be generated. And so I've heard, you know, you just mentioned it in talking a little bit about sort of your herpetocultural origin story, where you talked about, like, I don't remember much. I don't remember all of the details, and I don't remember this, but I remember this one moment, and it was like, whoa, you know. Yeah. And I feel like that's been a really, really common theme among almost all of our guests, where there was like this sort of undeniable, momentous eureka type moment, you know. So something that struck me, because it's interesting to me that you had a similar experience, and it was just like, oh yeah, yet another person with such a, because that's kind of beautiful. Like, that's really, I don't know, I think that's quite strange. So I don't think there are many moments like that in life in general. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that too. It's like, there's definitely something about that. I think that, like, Philippe de Vogely has kind of spoken to that there's like often like this kind of like almost like the interest in herpetofauna or animals or something is like this like latent thing that needs like to be, yeah, ignited in some way. It needs to be like initiated in some way.
Yeah.
And that, like, there's probably a lot of people out there that would like they would get hooked if they like had the moment, you know, to like, they had the dad who was like, here's this hunter and milk snake. Or in my case, it was like, my dad brought home a California king snake in a deli cup for me, you know, from the reptile show. And that's my earliest memory that I can like clearly pinpoint. I was 3 years old, you know, but I remember this like black and white snake in a deli cup on, you know, aspen shavings. And yeah, I think that's just that's a powerful thing, you know. And yeah. I forget how Philippe phrased it. He has a specific phrase for that, and I can't place it in this moment, but he definitely spoke about it in our episode with him. But
he did. Yeah. Anyway, not to derail this or anything. So Jamie, you know, Roy sent me the article that you're working on, or the sort of paper that you're working on, that is sort of the I don't remember exactly how you titled it, but the way you're sort of like pitching the use of a lot of these concepts and formulation around marine fish keeping and importing that into herpetoculture. Is that a fair assessment of that paper, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I titled it Aquatic Concepts for Herpetoculture. And, you know, the point, I continually hear people bring up, you know, aquariums, or you'll hear a lot, especially on your podcast, you hear a lot of the guests who say things like, I was into marine aquariums, or I was in freshwater aquariums, or, you know, I think of, they'll use analogies like, Phil, you know, you've always used the one about a koi and goldfish, which on a tangent, there is an interesting point I think we should talk about on that, because we can talk about that later, you know, whenever you want. But all right. So this is, I think about this every time you use that analogy. So the initial background with koi and goldfish were that, you know, they were bred in these, either, you know, koi in general you see in ponds, and in goldfish they were initially bred in these huge pots, right? And so all koi, in terms of distinguishment between, you know, pattern and everything, are looking from a top-down view. Yeah. So I always think it's interesting to take someone like you, who keeps all of your or most of your uromastics, let's say, in top-down views. There is a strong possibility that if you were to do this for 50 years, your animals would start exhibiting more pattern on the top, because that's what you're seeing, than necessarily on the side. So like someone like Camille Hammer, who you had on, I've seen his setups. He might, even if he's not thinking about it, start breeding for more side pattern. So, you know, just talking about line breeding or some sort of, you know, conceptually, we are influencing the animals that we bring into captivity in a lot of ways. And I know you've discussed, you know, changing the color and pattern, but to me in domestication, but that's always an interesting thing to me is like, going back to the artist analogy, we're painting with materials that we have, but we're also painting what we see. And, if you're looking down on the animal, you're going to see something different than someone who's looking from the side. So, back to the article tangent. So, I heard, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I mean, I actually, if it's okay, I'd love to actually kind of bracket this a little bit further because, I think that there are other ways that particular frame of reference is applicable. I mean, if you look at dog breeds, you have sort of like field variety dog breeds and family pet variety dog breeds, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an example of the way, sort of purpose and utility in some regard is influencing appearance, right? Using the art analogy yet again, there are many, many movements in the fine art world that their entire reason for being, their entire mode of experimentation is to how do we, like Picasso, this is sort of like the traditional example, and I don't necessarily like to lean on Picasso because I think he's sort of over referenced, and there's plenty of other really great artists, but he's just an easy one to lean on. Part of why he started making like fucking weird, like weird artwork is because it was about it was about the question of what does it mean to represent a 3-dimensional object in 2-dimensional space, which is to say that the medium, the mode of delivery of the artwork in some ways informs the appearance of that artwork, right? So that's sort of, to me, that sounds like what you're saying, which is like the way we're keeping these animals sort of is gonna, it's in some ways is like informing the way the animals look, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a fascinating concept. That's interesting about Cam. And what's even funnier is like part of the reason, other than just the open air ventilation and sort of simplicity around keeping animals in open top cages, part of the other reason I started doing it is because it's sort of like, well, this is how it became easier for me to conceptualize and design enclosures, because when I go out to Arizona and I start looking around in rock piles and stuff like that, that's kind of how I'm seeing it, is from standing over, looking kind of down at stones and at a space. So it became easier for me to kind of like imagine how something might be useful for an animal based on, the kind of stuff I was encountering out in wild places. So that's actually a really interesting perspective. And I had not had anybody else really note that to me or anything like that. Anyway, sorry, we can go back towards the article. I just had to I wanted to push a little further on that.
No, but that's the point, right? Is, a lot of people use analogies, and if you don't have the background in it, the analogy is still very, very useful. Like I think the koi and goldfish example was interesting, but it brings to mind different things because I just have a different experience, and frankly, my experience in herpetoculture is very, very small in comparison to my experience dealing with hundreds. I've bred hundreds of freshwater fish species, and I've sold them to the public. I've wholesaled them. So, I have experience in the industry. So, that was kind of my purpose. And I wanted to reach out because I think it would be nice to kind of consolidate some of the ideas into something that's easy for people to reference, and I think a lot of people are going to listen to your podcast and they're going to say, wow, they have some really interesting ideas about the aquarium hobby or the industry, but we don't necessarily know where to start too. It'd be like trying to find out, being an aquarium hobbyist and saying, I want to try to learn something from the reptile guys. You can find someone who's keeping their stuff in a shoebox and, you might not learn as much, or you could find someone who's keeping dart frogs in a biotope, which is a term we can talk about later, obviously, that's, got all these beautiful bromeliads from the area they're from. So, there's a lot of variety. I think it's important to kind of take a step back and level set, because it's not, the aquarium hobby is not some mystical thing that just exists out there in space. It's very similar in some ways, but it's further along because it is much older. And I think that kind of helps a lot.
Yeah. I definitely think like age is a huge part of it. I mean, in some ways, I've asked this question in other contexts, but what really distinguishes the reptile or the herpetocultural world from any other like kept animal? It's just time. All the other differences between like horses and pigs and chickens and goats and dogs and cats and guinea pigs and hamsters and gerbils. It's just time. Right? All of those other differences they'll be like a natural byproduct of keeping these animals for 1,000 years, I mean, it'll have to be even if they're ones that are accidental that we never anticipated. And I'm sort of, it's interesting. I feel like in some ways, herpetoculture and aquaculture, even though aquaculture has been around for a lot longer, I totally get that. I think that they have incredibly unique distinctions from other realms, right? Because most of the other domestic animals all have some goofy utility, right? Whether it's their power, or they can help us hunt, or they're good to eat, or they lay eggs, or whatever, bees, you name it. But in some ways, fish and herps almost resemble tulips a little more than they do anything else. It's like they're just there because they're fucking awesome, right? They're not necessarily, except, with some crossover here and there. We know people are eating iguanas and butterfly agamas, and people are eating herps in various places in various ways, which is totally cool in my mind. But for the most part, I just like to look at them and I like to have them around. I mean, it's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's like it's similar to a tulip in a lot of ways, right? So I feel like we have like this really unique position where we can look at these other worlds, whether it's horticulture or any of the other domestic creatures, and pull a certain set of lessons from those. In some ways, herpetoculture is like it's like a photography. When photography first came up as a tool, as a way of generating images and whatnot, there had already been hundreds and thousands of years of art history before it, and so you had all this stuff happening in photography that was compressed into like 150, 200 years. Like all of art history happened in photography in a very, very short period of time. And it was like every other day, somebody was like, oh, you could do this with your photos. You try that. You try like printing them on a paintbrush and all this, like putting in the silver salute, all this it's crazy the way, like how rapidly that all happened. And so in some ways, I feel like there's a lot of intrigue for me around what's going to happen next in herpetoculture and also like sort of setting that tone. And okay, anyway, I'm getting a little carried away and distracted here. These beers, man. Let me tell you, these giant beers.
I think that one thing that comes through for me in that too is just like there's something about, because like there's a similarity I feel in some ways with like some of aquaculture and herpetoculture where it just feels like closer, like we're closer to the wild type, than it feels like we would be with like dogs or cats. And like almost that almost comes that informs like the way we even think about it, and just like the other day, for an example of this, I have some friends who just bought the parcel of land next to my land, and they just like set up a catio basically so they can have their cats there. And I was in their catio meeting their cats, and they just had like a bunch of manzanita branches from the land that they'd put in there for the cats to climb on. And I was like, see, this is cool because it's like, it just feels it's like they're there for the animals' enrichment. But like most of the time when I'm thinking about like what a catio would be furnished by, I'm thinking about like this like stuff covered in like that carpet, that, like cat trees and stuff like that. And it's like you could actually just use a branch from a tree, and it does the same thing. But in some ways, it's like I think a lot of people wouldn't even think of that. Like they just picture the cat in the context of like Petco. What do they sell at Petco for the cat? And the same thing for like the dogs, you know, where it's like, you know, with our dog, like, you know, like she would be happy if I just dug her a hole in the ground, you know, like she would prefer that to like a kennel, you know?
Yeah. Well, even weirder is when it goes in the other direction. You know, we just got a cat wheel for our cats. That's fucking bizarre.
Oh yeah. Cause they love it, right?
Weird, dude. We have 2 cats. One of them, she's on that thing all the time, and she'll just like get up a gallop and she'll go over there and stand on it and look at us, and will meow at us and yell at us until we come over to her and entertain her while she's walking on the wheel. it's so bizarre. And
isn't there like studies that like people have like put like a hamster wheel out in the forest and like with a game on it, and all kinds of animals will use it, you know?
Frogs, rodents, all kinds of creatures, not just
funny.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's because of dopamine, I guess.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, but there's something to be said for that. So I have I had a cat that I got. She lived in Miami where I was at for when I got her, I just kidnapped her, which, you know, kind of, but she was 4 years old. So that cat, my cat, her name's Meatloaf. She's great, but I tell everyone the same thing. She's closer in terms of care to the snakes that I kept than any dog I've owned. Like growing up, I had labs. She is significantly closer in terms of the way that she acts and thinks. You can see it. Like she won't walk through doorways. She always peeks around. She doesn't play with any toy except the little mice that squeak.
Yeah.
If it doesn't make noise, she will not respond. She'll hit it once and never look at it again. It's very similar. The way that she reacts to things is, you know, and I have to be careful because she kind of, you forget it. And then you do stuff like if I raise my voice at her, she doesn't understand it in a way that like a domesticated animal will and kind of get over it. She kind of looks at it as, oh shit, he's way bigger than me. And, you know, he's going to beat me up, you know? So she's extremely territorial towards other cats. She's fine with dogs. So yeah, in a lot of ways though, they're very similar. And I think you're right. It's closer to the wild type, you know, and in both hobbies, I think the sweet spot for what we're trying to do in terms of herpetoculture or you know, propagating fish, is that F1 generation, right? You know, you don't have the F0, you don't have the wild type, like the actual wild ones where you have all the issues. You want that first generation where the babies have grown up in captivity, but they functionally look the same as the wild adults. So, you know, yeah, I definitely think you're right. I think that's the appeal to exotic animals in general. Like you start domesticating them too much and they're not exotic animals any longer. And while that might lead to more acceptance from general public, you lose a little bit of what I think brings a lot of, you know, to the table. Because I think it's been proven in a lot of ways that most people remember negative memories instead of positive memories for much longer periods of time. They're more, you know, because it's a survival mechanism, right? You remember negative things. I think there's a very good chance that like Roy, you and I remember like the snake memories. One, because it was what could have been a negative memory. Cause I think there's a part of the brain that says like, some things are scary, but that got turned into a positive by the way it was presented to us. And I think that combination of it's something new and foreign and exotic makes it stick out, even when it was in fact a positive memory. So, you know, and that's kind of, I think the point with those animals is you can do a lot, but at a certain point you domesticated out the interesting factors to a large degree.
Yeah. That's kind of becomes something else, you know, like it just be like, I don't think it like loses value entirely or anything like that necessarily, but I think it does become something different. You know, I think about like for me, like looking at, like looking through, like I hate to draw on this, but I have to, because it's where my mind goes with this is like the ball python, you know, worlds. And it's like, it's just like a bunch of pictures of all these different morphed out snakes with the same general, you know, like silhouette on a white background or on like a black background. It's like completely divorced from like the wild context from which that creature's ancestors emerged. And it doesn't even feel like the same thing anymore, you know? And it's just really interesting to me. Yeah, it's not the same thing. Like we've talked about many times, but it's just a trip for me, because I think that this is like, therein lies kind of one of the central tensions within herpetoculture, right? When like part of why we ask that question at the end of every episode of why herpetoculture is to like emphasize that like people are doing this for different reasons. And like my reasons are very different from somebody who's doing that form of ball python thing, and just like wants to see the animal out of context. Like for me, like I want to see the animal contextualized as much as possible, like, because that's what's actually interesting to me. And I don't think it's like a good or bad necessarily binary on it. It's just like, it's just different.
Yeah. Right? It's sort of like, that when we're talking more and more about this, the differences between, sort of ways of keeping animals in the home or nearby the home, if you're on a farm or what have you. I think, and Jamie, you mentioned like that F1, right? There's something about that F1 that's real special, and I agree with that there, and I think there's something about, as much as I love the idea that I can get a puppy, and I can go to a vet and I can say, hey, I just got a puppy, help. And the vet will give it all the shots that it needs. And the vet will give it, tell me, here's the you need to get heartworm meds during the spring and summer. And you need to get like a rabies shot every 3 years. And then you need to get, here's the food that you get for this puppy. And if your puppy gets an allergy, here's the food you get. And as soon as your puppy gets overweight, we can put it on this food. And if there is something that's remarkable and beautiful about the ability for us to, for lack of a better way of putting it, like unravel the care and propagation of a particular species of animal. There is something amazing in that. Mm-hmm. But it does, for me, it does kind of sap. And this is a very limited perspective, because it's not as if I can't do this with my dog or my cat, right? We can do this too, but it does kind of sap and pull out some of what's fun about it. It's like there's something about the mystery and the intrigue and the active problem solving. Maybe that's where the similarity for me between herpetoculture and martial arts, one of the ways they become similar, because it's like with combat sports, you're like on the fly problem solving. It's like on the fly, and if you fuck up, you're going to feel it right away, because somebody's either going to knock you out or somebody's going to break your arm or somebody's going to choke you unconscious, but when there's something similar about that with our herps in some regard, which is like, there's some relatively high consequence, sometimes, depending on what you're dealing with. And, some of us favor animals that have a higher resilience to those mistakes, and some of us deal with stuff that has really high sensitivity to those mistakes. But, there's something about having there's something that it's not fully figured out. It's not, I can't go buy a Euro diet somewhere. I can't go buy a Missouri brand Euromastix pellet. And it's like, you can feed this thing. All you got to do is buy a Euro from me, put it in this cage, put it in with these lights, and feed it these pellets. And you're going to have a healthy functioning Euro for 30 years. Like, you're not going to have that. And it doesn't mean that it's not great, because one of the things that, like Rach and I do this with our cats and with our dog, we're constantly looking for ways to make their lives better. And a lot of times that looks like, being informed by the wild type and saying, all right, what are these cats in Persia and Syria eating? You know what I mean? It's like, just give them mice, give them birds. That's pretty, that kind of thing. Right. It's, and there's a lot of, how do you bring them back to that more wild state? It's what we're doing with us, with people too. It's like, well, I'm going to have to deadlift, and I'm going to have to run, and I'm going to have to eat vegetables and meat and whatever. And I'm getting a little off track here, but, again, I agree with you, Roy. It's not sort of a good or bad. It's just because I have great sympathies for the ball python, the leopard gecko, the bearded dragon, sort of medicalized, really what it's medicalized isn't even the right word. Actually, what it is this animal, this wild animal that we've taken and infused a little bit of culture into, and then now we're putting it in a gallery. Mm-hmm. In my mind, that's what it is. This is a gallery, right? And I have great sympathies for that. I part of what made me fall in love with herpetoculture to some degree is that area, that world of like, oh my God, there's all these, there's so many fucking leopard geckos. You can get so many different kinds of crazy looking leopard geckos. And you mean to tell me that this thing is the same species as this thing? That's insanity. Like, I love that realm also. But now I'm really rambling. All right, now I'm really getting off. Go ahead.
There actually is 2 points that I think are interesting when you talk about this, because as someone coming from the aquarium hobby, and again, it's much older, color types, they don't really refer to them as morphs, even though they are significantly more entrenched, right? Like, it's been around for a very long time. And there's 2 things. I personally, so take a ball python, for example. A wild type ball python is fucking beautiful. They're black, the blacks, they're stunning. It is not that animal's fault that someone bred a wobble into it and gave it a dumbass name. It's just not, it's just not. I'm sorry, and the morph thing, I view morphs in 2 camps. Mm-hmm. There's morphs that respect the dignity of the animal, and there are morphs that don't. And so to me, examples of the ones that don't are spider ball pythons, scoria boas, jaguar carpets. Those are the big 3 that come out to me immediately. The animal lost its dignity. You could also add in scaleless in a lot of ways, though I don't know the health effects of those well enough to really discuss them. But the other 3, people have bred in a deleterious gene because it made their yellows more yellow. You have chosen color over the dignity of the animal. Any other morph, I don't have an issue with. I don't care if they're banana, whatever, it doesn't bother me, because it's just not something I'm interested in. Because I remember before those things were there, I remember seeing the first pied at Daytona, and it was $10,000, like pied ball python. It was insane. I remember looking at that animal and being like, that's the coolest fucking animal I've ever seen in my whole life. And I still to this day like piebald ball pythons, but my point with that is you can retain some of the dignity of the animal while changing the pattern, but there is a line the aquarium hobby is just as guilty. Short body fish, long fins, you take a betta, long fins, that's not what they look like in the wild. They're a short fin fish. And the fighting ones that they still breed over in Southeast Asia, they call them placats. And placats have short fins because if they have long fins and they fight, they get them ripped off. Mm. So, it's one of those things that you can retain the dignity of the animal even while changing it somewhat, and it's not necessarily an issue. The other thing I would like to bring up when it comes to these morphs and everything is you got to remember, like, we and a lot of your listeners are old enough to remember the hobby prior to those morphs. But when I'm at these shows, if they're 20 years old and they go look at ball pythons, all those morphs in terms of the freshness to them are equal. They're looking at a wild type and a pied, and they never remember a time before pieds came in. So it's you got an environment where people, if they grow up with it, don't see it as abnormal. And so that's why I also have a concern when you deal with morphs that do kind of restrict the dignity of the animals, to me personally. And and I say this, and I'm not going online and going, oh, this person's a bad person. Oh, they do this. Like, I just ignore it. If they sell them, I ignore them. I don't buy animals from the people that breed them. I don't, I never will. It's just one of those situations where if you have a problem with it and you ignore it and they're not getting the attention for the new morph, or they're not selling these animals, it's only going to take, 1 or 2 clutches where they're stuck with 20 jaguar carpets and they have to wholesale them. And then the wholesaler is saying, nah, I don't want them. I can't sell them. Everyone realizes that thing's going to have a wobble, and then boom, it's done. That's what happens in this stuff. The problem is a lot of those morphs, and even in the aquarium hobby, like the short body stuff, is immensely popular. Mm-hmm. So, it's just everyone's different with it. But yeah, I agree. I think, there's something to be said for the wild types. I prefer wild types in virtually everything I keep. But again, my distinction is dignity, not dignity. And that's kind of how I've always viewed it with that stuff.
Yeah, it's really fair. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned something there about the nation's youth growing up in a world that, all those things were already there from the jump, the albino, the pied, whatever, you name it. They were already there. And that also reminded me yet again of martial arts, which is this, in the sense that,
they don't remember a time before Gordon Ryan, man.
Oh God. Don't get me started on that fucking guy. No, he's great. The guy is an incredible practitioner. But no, the reason I mentioned, that's funny. That's very funny. But the reason I mention it is because there are cycles in any combat sport, So like within jiu-jitsu in particular, you see trends going all the time. They're always cycling. And you'll see things go in favor and out of favor, and in favor and out of favor, and they go back and forth. And then eventually you see breaks, So like right now, I think we're seeing a big break between gi and no gi jiu-jitsu, which to me is kind of weird. Sort of like the break between wrestling and judo, right? It's like they're both takedown arts, but, one is just like, a little different than the other. And the preferences and whatever. And that's great. I love them all. But, the break, boxing and kickboxing. It's like, it's weird to me that we ever developed something where you couldn't kick with your legs at the same time as punch. But anyway, the reason I say that is, we've talked about on this show before about how it does appear that there are more people making their way into herpetoculture right now who seem more interested in, Jamie, as you put it, the dignity of the animal, right? And that's great. That's a good thing. And I agree for the most part about, sort of the dignity of the animal. I do feel like there are ways in which we can use other animals as a lens through which to say, at what point does, because conceivably dignity of the animal could be a very bendable, pliable term, right? Because let's look at various dog breeds that, put to certain extremes, don't really maybe these breeds have a particular utility in mind, but there's a point at which that utility pulls away from the dignity of that animal. I'm thinking of like pugs or bulldogs that have such smashed in craniums and sinuses that they've got sleep apnea and they've got short lives and they can't give natural birth. At the same time, I kind of get it to a certain degree. Like, I don't want to see it, and I prefer animals that could get by and do their own thing. I very much prefer it. But I wonder, I don't know. I guess I can imagine, I think about Sphinx cats. Ugh, God, they look like scrotums. They're just like these stupid. They're so dumb, but I have friends who have them, and they're great cats. They're wonderful, wonderful cats. They're super cute, but they look like ball sacks. It's just the way it is. But to me, that's an example of something that's not necessarily a deleterious trait, but does not respect the dignity of that animal in any regard. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like I've never heard anybody phrase it that way before. So I'm intrigued, and I hope you don't feel like I'm trying to criticize that particular phrase, because part of the way my brain works is it's easier for me to take on a new idea or concept, or when I hear something new that I haven't heard before, the way I like to kind of figure it out is let me see if I can jab a little hole in this thing, let me see if I can find a problem. Because then if I can't find a problem with it, I'm like, all right, I have to adopt this now, because now it's too, it's too good. Right. And sometimes I don't know enough, but I don't know. I just feel like, are there examples of morphs in, because some of the ones that come to my mind are, what were those lemon frost leopard geckos, which great looking, incredible looking geckos, beautiful. Every one of them gets cancer, right? They get tumors within a year. They just get tumors. And it is a real bummer because I don't know the exact ins and outs. I have some background information on the origin of those geckos. And I know some of that history, but it sounds like, that there's not much there. And to me, that's like a real bummer. That's a huge problem. On the other hand, you have the Enigma leopard gecko, which it's like, okay, the Enigma leopard gecko is similar to the spider ball python. They're like wobbly and they're kind of dwarfy. And yet they are beautiful and they eat on their own. They don't need assistance. They do their own thing. Like, is that an example of a gecko that's more of a middle of the road? Is that, at what point is the dignity sufficiently compromised for us to say, all right, this is no longer acceptable? Is it easy enough to conceive of animals in which it's a blurred border at best? Because I think we're at a stage in herpetoculture where most of those animals are like, most of those morphs are pretty cut and dry, right? Scaleless bearded dragons and corn snakes and whatever kind of make me want to throw up a little bit. Lemon frost leopard geckos is a real bummer, translucent bearded dragons. Those are kind of, to me, that's like a middle of the road because they're not terrible. They're not like, obviously there's nothing like inherently wrong with the translucent bearded dragon, but it's also not like a good thing in some regard, right? Like they kind of like missing something really vital in some regard. In fairness, I don't know enough about. Anyway, I'm rambling again, but I don't know.
It's a good point though. Just like, like where does one designate that line? I think about even just like, dogs again is a good example. It's like, for some people, they'd probably say like, man, we really messed up when we bred Chihuahuas. And then there are other people that are like, no way, Chihuahuas are the greatest thing we've ever done.
The worst dog.
But I think it's important to have these conversations. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like everyone's different. And for me, I'm the same though. Mm-hmm. I will not own a pug. I will not own a French bulldog. It's the same thing across the board for me. But again, you're right. There are a lot of examples where, it's not necessarily life or death. And everyone's got to kind of like, that's why I brought up the scaleless. I don't know enough about them. I don't know if it causes issues if they go across, because, if you're keeping them on paper towels, who cares? But if you're putting them on something like aspen, is it going to make him more susceptible to rips? Or if they get stuck on a rock, like, is it, if there's a deleterious portion to that, then, that to me is a no-go. But again, everyone's got to look at this in their own light. And I'm also not a big fan of going online and, calling people bad people for liking them, for breeding them. I'm more of you just let it weed it out, because especially with morphs in particular, the entire purpose of the morph thing is to be one step ahead of everyone else and to get attention for it. If no one cares about your scaleless, rat snake, and no one did 30 years ago, there probably was someone who bred, scaleless, and they just froze it or fed it to something. It's like, if no one cares, eventually no one will do it. If enough people care, then enough people do it. And the market kind of has to decide as a whole. I know people, again, want to get online and say, well, we have to increase the standards of care and everything. And I completely agree with that. But at a certain point, you have to understand that there are things that you might not agree with in the hobby that aren't necessarily wrong, that you just don't like them. It's.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, what you just said about the morph thing, I don't know, like I'm a little resistant to the idea that it's about being one step ahead of everybody else. Maybe just that one segment. I don't mean to get too rough on this. In some ways, like, what's the difference between, because what you just said about, let's say, like all of the things you just said that you could apply to a morph, you could apply the same thing to anything. So I was just talking with Roy before the show that I just bought these stupid sandfish. Like I got a group of 6 of these skinkis sandfish, these Egyptian sandfish, and it's like they're $20 a piece. It's not like nobody cares about sandfish, right? They're just sitting there doing their thing. Nobody cares. They're imported by the thousands, whatever. Nobody's really bothered to breed them. Nobody's really bothered to screw with those things for too long. And it's like, so in the same way that what you just said applies to certain mutations, the same thing applies to certain animals. Like if you bring in sandfish, nobody cares about them. Nobody buys them. Nobody gives them the time of day. Then they're going to be kind of weeded out. The market kind of weeds them out of demand and out of existence in captivity. And then at the same time, in order to propagate something ethically and to have it around in a responsible manner, you kind of need a demand for it. So it's like they kind of feed one another in my mind. Like I think it was Philippe de Beaujolais' discussion at Herpeton where he talked about how the leopard gecko trade was sort of reinvigorated by the appearance of the albino leopard gecko, right? And it's like, okay, in some ways, like one thing has to come first, like something has to sustain, right? I don't know anything. Is there any animal or any widely kept species of any organism that's just kept because it looks like the same thing that it looked like in the wild? Is there anything? Is there anything at all? I don't think there's a single thing. There's nothing, right? Like none of them. Like all of them become something else once they're here. And I don't necessarily, I'm not trying to make a statement about whether or not I think that's right or wrong. It's just, it seems to me that I don't know how we can help it. I feel like there's sort of, I don't know, this is something I've been kind of going on and on this show about, I think at length, which is, I think that at least from my vantage point, it seems like the second they're here, the second we're dealing with stuff in captivity, we're talking about a different animal. We're talking about something else altogether. Like, we were talking about these, morphs and deleterious effects of deleterious mutations or respecting the dignity of an animal. Well, okay. Part of the other reason that that's an easily blurred boundary in my mind is that it's sort of like a one man's trash is another man's treasure kind of thing. Any kind of mutation that seems whack in one context, you change the context, turn that dial by 5 degrees, and all of a sudden that's a useful thing, right? Maybe not the spinny thing or, whatever, but I could imagine a scaleless. I'm getting really reaching here at this point. This is not my personal opinion. This is just me trying to play devil's advocate here, but it's like, I could imagine a scaleless bearded dragon being like an absolutely ideal pet if you could give it the proper circumstances to where it could thrive on its own and do its thing. Maybe it's great for small kids whose tiny little sensitive skin hands get poked by the little dragon side scales. I don't know. I mean, again, I'm really reaching here, but I'm just trying to I don't know. I feel like we're working something out here. I don't know. Yeah, I'm getting I'm going to have to stop there because I feel like I'm
Did you have a thought on it, Jamie?
I mean, and again, when I say the morph game inherently requires you to keep taking these steps to be, I'm not saying that in a good or bad way. I'm not saying,
sure.
It's bad to have 200 morphs of leopard geckos compared to having one. Like once you have one, it seems to be that there seems to be a consistent amount. And I don't necessarily, again, I have a high tolerance for morphs because coming from fish, they're just everywhere. And they keep continuing to be everywhere. Like it took clownfish, when I initially got in the hobby, they were pretty much all wild caught. It took about 10 generations of clownfish before morphs started popping up, and the morphs are immensely popular. And it's got a lot of people keeping clowns, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different. But again, if all of a sudden the clowns had one fin or the short body, that's where I draw the line personally, because to me personally, that's where the animal's dignity has been lost compared to the wild type. But again, you make a good point. Do we ever need to really compare to the wild type? These are not wild animals, and I think that's kind of what you were saying. And that is a good, point to this, is that across exotic animals, it's like, where's the break? Is it at that F1 or F0 to F1? Is that where the break is? Is it F1 to F10? Is it when all of a sudden it pops out and it's got red eyes and it's white and it's worth $10,000 instead of 200? It's definitely a scale. So a sliding scale.
Yeah. And it's also, I think that's a really interesting point too, because, the animals that we have, they're never going to go back in the wild. They're never going to be back out there. No. It's never going to happen, right? Now, of course, we have situations in which that is on the table, right? In zoological institutions where it's like, okay, we might release a bunch of these back in the wild. Now, all right, let's not pull any fuckery. We've got to keep this thing as true to what we can imagine the wild type to be as possible, because we have like a North Star for that, right? This is, like California condors. It's like, we, better not make a fucking featherless California condor, right? And then you also have the other. Sorry, you like that, Roy?
Imagining a featherless California condor is just quite the image.
Naked turkey flying around.
That thing would be terrifying.
Yeah,
Could you imagine that thing
able to fly around.
I saw one of the
like, oh shit,
it's a pterodactyl.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm dead now.
Yeah, exactly. We're all screwed. But then you also have the other end of that too, which is you have, I've seen corn snake breeders, leopard gecko breeders, bearded dragon breeders put in generations of effort to breed out different recessive traits from a given line. It's like, I just want a fucking gray and yellow bearded dragon. And I want a goddamn black and white and yellow leopard gecko. And I want a goddamn regular old freaking corn snake from wherever, Florida. I just, there's the overboard too. And you see breeders having to overcorrect the other direction and say, we just need a normal, right? And there's a utility, like I swear I've seen articles or posts titled "The Utility of Normals," which is like that in and of itself is like a fascinating concept to think that we have people like writing about that. But I get it. I also get it, and then you've got weird other examples like the Kingorum, Varanus kingorum, right? Those the little tiny dwarf monitors. Like pretty much all of them seem to have that weird albino or whatever trait that floats through the Kingorum. They almost all seem to have it. And it's like, that's also like a result of like it's like just a tiny population of founding animals, right? You've got there's like a type of snapping turtle or something where there's only albinos available in captivity. My employee, Brendan, was telling me about them. I can't remember which kinds he was mentioning to me, but that's totally weird. That's totally freaking strange. And like, obviously there's a lot of ways to look at this. And I think that we should probably have a lot of everything, right? In the same way that we have breeders that are dedicated to golden retrievers, I love the idea that we might have breeders who are dedicated to the health and well-being of piebald and albino ball pythons, and like how, like that's fascinating too. And so there are ways in which it's also about like refinement and not necessarily just being the next, I got to get the next thing. I got to get the next thing and hit that next benchmark. There's so many ways one can inhabit morphs. I think, I don't know. I'm not sure why I got so stuck on this topic. Maybe unless you both have something else to add to this, maybe now would be the time to veer back to your article.
All right, it's a fish time.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know I kind of set the stage. And the second I heard, I said dignity animal, I knew.
Great.
Yeah. So when it comes to the fish, so the article I sent Roy, I kind of broke down into a bunch of different topics, and I think I didn't do them by any sort of order in terms of importance, but I did start with the ones that I think are more concrete, that are more applicable, and then kind of went down. I'm not referencing it on my computer, but I remember the first one, and that was the difference in terms of care of the animals for professional breeders, hobbyist breeders, and hobbyists. And I think this is a very important lesson that we in the the reptile community and herpetoculture can learn from. It's not as prevalent. The distinctions are not as great in frogs and in lizards. And that's because those animals will fucking die if you don't put them in the right conditions. Snakes, unfortunately, are victims of their own success and can live in stuff that is significantly different than, what they would generally see. But so let's talk about and I struggle to use the word aquaculture because when I was growing up, aquaculture was fish farming for food. We generally referred to it as ornamental fish farming for the aquarium hobby. And then over time, though, aquaculture has become the term. And a lot of that had to do with people breeding and propagating corals. Corals have become an unbelievable industry, and so a lot of times they actually call those aquaculture facilities now. So I might call it just fish rearing or breeding or something, but I mean aquaculture in the sense for ornamental fish, not in terms of fish food, food or any of that. So, the large fish farms that are breeding most of the freshwater ornamental stuff are pretty much along the same longitudinal band where, it's Southeast Asia and Florida, because they can keep them outside and they can keep them in these huge ponds. Then you have the people that are breeding what I would call the boutique species, so things that can't be in these large ponds. They breed them in these aquariums, and the aquariums generally follow the same pattern. And I bred tons of species this way. It is a bare bottom aquarium because you feed them way heavier than you normally would. So you're siphoning out detritus, you're siphoning out fish waste and everything. Generally a terracotta pot, maybe 2 terracotta pots, maybe some plants if the fish in general use the plants for some sort of part of the breeding, right? So you've got this bare bones setup. And then you have hobbyist breeders who do something similar to that, but also a lot of times will incorporate things like substrate, because the fact that they have less aquariums or less fish that they're doing this for. In addition, if you're breeding professionally, substrate is an additional cost, right? So you're trying to maintain, the cost and everything. Then you have the hobbyists and the people who have everything from these beautiful planted aquariums to a skull in the corner and an anchor and a bunch of fish going around, right? What I think is unusual in the reptile hobby, and what I'd like to see people critically analyze, is for some reason, especially with snakes, the tendency has become every single person has to keep them like the breeder keeps them.
Yeah.
Like you get a lot of people who I don't even want to use ball pythons anymore because I feel like they get a bad rap, but any sort of, it doesn't matter what it is, colubrids or whatever, people raise them. The breeders are doing the rack systems initially for economy of scale, right? You do everything the same, or like Phil, even in your situation, I'm sure the more you can make things similar and the more that you can maintain it, it's an economy of scale thing. It becomes much easier, but that's not, for some reason. And I think it's a couple things. First and foremost, I think you will see people on the end consumer being told to keep them in the same conditions that the breeder keeps them. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. One of the main reasons, so when we were bringing in freshwater angelfish, one of the most popular fish on the planet, right? We would get them from suppliers from different countries and different places. Some countries would breed them in huge vats, and they would continually dose them with antibiotics to be able to make sure that the animals did not get sick and die while they were doing it, right? There was always a low-level antibiotic. We get them in the store and they would get placed in aquariums with other animals, and you would see mortality rates. And they had a massive mortality rate when they got bought by people and put in their aquariums. And these people are coming to us and they're saying, dude, you sold us a sick fish because every other fish I've got is fine. The aquarium we're testing is fine. And what it came down to is effectively some of these people were basically boy in a bubble, situation, these fish, they're not used to it. And I think one of the reasons that it's become so prevalent, especially in snakes, is the idea that you can't keep a lot of these in terrariums, is because these breeders boy in a bubble. You've got them in these sterile tubs with everything is sterile. And then, yes, they fail when they get put in an environment completely different, right? And then, so what's become is the breeders basically have said, we're going to not claim responsibility. We're going to teach you how we did it, and then we're going to sell it like this. The issue is you got a lot of people, especially coming to the hobby now, who look at it and say, why do I have to keep it in this tub? It doesn't live in a tub in the wild. It makes no sense, right? And so I think the breeders in the reptile hobby need to do a much better job at preparing the animals for the end person. If you know the end person is going to try to take this ball python and put it in a terrarium, it might behoove you to make sure that those animals can live in that terrarium, right? But and by the same token, the people who are buying these animals need to support people who do this, and also understand if we demand this of the breeders, professional breeders or hobbyist breeders, we have to be willing to pay more for that animal, because they are not going to be able to do the same economy of scale. So that is one of the first things that I think is an interesting topic, is just the difference. The stratas in the fish hobby do not seem to be respected as much in the reptile hobby. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of reasons, but I think that is something that we all need to consider, is why is the initial push for everyone to keep these reptiles the same way as if you were going to breed them, like a professional breeder's breeding them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I think there's a lot of cool things in there. I had this happen to a certain degree, but in the opposite direction. There's a breeder, Uromastyx breeder, great guy. I love him to death, and I'm certainly not criticizing the way he does things at all. I've gotten a couple of animals from him that when they come to my place, they don't do well. And it's not that they don't eventually do fine. It's that it takes them like a year or more to settle in and become used to the way things are done here. And part of that, I think, has to do with the way he sets everything up. It's so complex and so, I don't even know what the word would be, but it's almost as if it's too good in some ways. They're kind of spoiled, right? So when they come here and they get it's a little bit more difficult for them. It's top opening enclosures, not front facing. It's, you name it. So when they come here, it's like a little bit more difficult for them to settle in and sort of get the ball rolling. Whereas with the way I do things here, I try to set it up, and I actually am doing things all the time, like sending out the youngsters when they're a little bit younger for species like Uromastyx ornata, instead of waiting until they're 6 months old before you send them off, which some breeders used to do. They'd wait for a long time, wait till they got to a really big size. It's like Uromastyx hate change. The second you change them when they're already used to what they're doing, they hate it. They don't want to move around. If you send it to them when they're 4 to 6 weeks old, which, you work with an ornate and you take care of them well, they handle it no problem. I've been doing that for years now. And they settle in a lot more quickly at their new place because they're so young, they're still so pliable cognitively and experientially, right? I loved what you were saying about the idea about people supporting breeders who are doing things a little bit more ethically and doing things with a little bit more like artisanal in some ways, right? People who are really putting in that extra time, not necessarily scaling up their operation in an effort to keep things a little bit more pliable. I just love that term for this, pliability, right? I love the ways that there's sort of I've always thought this, but there's sort of an intellectualism that seems much more prevalent in aquarium hobby in the aquarium hobby. Whether it's because there's sort of a necessity to that, in the sense that you're dealing with chemistry, right? In some regard, and biological function in some way, in a way that's more impactful and more meaningful to the day-to-day care of those fish than in reptiles. And I think that that's coming into the reptile hobby too. Not to say that it hasn't been there in some capacity, but I feel like I meet more and more people who are more there's a more intellectual. There's an intellectual slant to the way people seem to be doing things at the moment, and the way more people are interested in doing things at the moment, that maybe, I don't want to say wasn't as prevalent, but didn't seem to be as popular maybe in reptiles 20, 30 years ago. And I could be wrong, could be myopic on my part, but I don't know. I really enjoy all of what you said. Sorry, Roy. I feel like we both just been talking over you.
No, it's fine.
Out with it, Roy. Out with it. Damn it.
Yeah, no, I think that what comes to mind for me too with that is just, there was a Animals at Home episode a few years ago, I think now, with TC Houston, Reptile Mountain, talking about, the kind of the emergence of like the small batch reptile breeder, people doing things. That's essentially what I'm trying to do on some level, is like, even the babies, that I'm raising up here, I'm still trying to offer them the same standard of care that I'm offering my adults, which isn't always easy or efficient to do. It's never the most efficient thing to do, to like set up every baby sulfurious in its own planted setup with UV and a halogen overhead and all that stuff. It would be a lot easier to put them in a rack, but I think that it does create more resilient animals on some level too. And I think that the majority of people, that are going to be, receiving these animals aren't just going to throw them in a rack. That's not the way that people tend to keep those snakes. So I think it makes sense in that regard. And it's something that's like this boy in a bubble kind of syndrome that you're describing. This is a lot of what, Liam and Ellie have been talking about on Reptiles and Research, and unpacking with this phenomenon with ball pythons. And I think that it's definitely, I'm grateful to finally be hearing that happening, like more and more people talking about that and acknowledging that that's a real phenomenon, because I've felt that's a thing for a long time, and I've experienced it in my own keeping. And it's interesting to think of it as something that's like a more established phenomenon and kind of more played out on some level from the aquarium side.
Well, I mean, it's also it's similar to like the way people are thinking about raising kids, right? So you want to have flexible, resilient children who don't get thrown totally out of whack when they don't have access to the things that make them comfortable all the time, right?
Yeah, there's the whole concept of like safe enough, and like enough stability. Obviously it's like nothing thrives in utter chaos, and also like nothing becomes resilient and well in utter stasis either. So as if that were a thing, but yeah.
Utter stasis, you don't think that's a thing?
Not that I've ever encountered.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's a little more stasis. Especially these days.
You're in a unique position in life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but you also can't blame people for wanting to give their animals that level of comfort, right? I mean, I don't.
Yeah. I don't think it's like coming from like a bad motivation or anything like that. I think that it's just it's like it's not about the motivation so much as just the impact. And like I think that it's a trippy thing for me to see like you spoke earlier about just like why is the like professional breeder style of husbandry kind of pitched toward the end consumer. And it's like, it's such a trip for me to see like single tub rack setups, and I'm like, why does that exist? It's like, it's just a funny thing. Like I didn't even know that those existed until I started seeing them posted online in various places. And I was like, whoa, that is a trippy thing, because I think that kind of stuff actually started to emerge more mainstream in herpetoculture, kind of in that hiatus period while I was away. So it's like there's been there was like a whole process of evolution occurring while I was gone. It's like I remember like the time before when it was like when I left, most people were still keeping their herps in like glass aquaria, or like wooden enclosures. PVC enclosures were like, if you were serious about reptiles, you had PVC enclosures, but those were like pretty new and spiffy, only a couple manufacturers. There wasn't like 50 different manufacturers to choose from with all these different options. And so it's just interesting to see that kind of progression happening.
And I get it that, I've been relatively vocal about my stance that the morph market and morphing in general is like not a pyramid scheme. I also understand why people feel like it is in some regard. And in some cases, I get it. You're right. If you want, you just said, why is there such thing as a single rack setup, right? Like our single tub rack setup. Why does that exist? It's like, okay, well, on the one hand, if you only have one goddamn snake, ball python, should probably set it up in something more substantial. Like, why wouldn't you? Right.
Yeah.
Like you want to get a dog and keep it in a kennel all the time, just because, like, or like a small kennel that you'd find it in a rescue, right? Or something like that. On the other hand, I also understand that in some regard, you have to have, as much as we're going to market to people who, we're going to say, all right, these are great pets. It's a great way to enrich your own psychology and enrich your life, enrich your microbiome. I mean, you name it. There's probably lots of great reasons to have animals in your home in some regard, right? There's so many reasons that we get into all the time on the show. That said, we also have to market to people who want to do this in the same way that you and I want, the way that you're doing it, Roy, or the way that I'm doing it, right? We need to have, golden retrievers aren't around because one person made a golden retriever and just threw them out into the world and said, good luck. They're around because we have generation after generation after generation of dedicated stewards of that type of dog into the future.
Right.
There's always some variety where some of those breeders are maybe moving towards like a less ethical manner, and then some of them are moving closer towards like a true north that we would all align with to some degree or another. And I feel like we have to have that also. We have to have both. In order to have a future herpetoculture at all, we absolutely have to have other people who grow up, get interested in large scale keeping and breeding and doing that as well. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and you're right, but that's my point. You do need professional breeders, but what we don't need is everyone being told they have to keep them the same way, And what I mean by that is, I have nothing against racks. I'm one of the people that, like when I was establishing the tree boas, you can do racks in a way that aren't a problem, that are not what the professional breeders are doing. Because again, if you're a professional, no one wants to hear this. You have to have economy of scale to make this profitable. The animals are only the price they're at because of the economy of scale, and so you have to have that. But what you don't need is the end consumer being told this is the way you have to keep them. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't align with their natural history. And then, in a lot of examples, like like ball pythons are an easy one, but you can take a tub and you can do a lot with it. Like when I was establishing the tree boas, it's awesome because what I would do is I would take the tubs. They liked the fact it was opaque because they were high stress animals. They're not visually oriented. And people need to understand the natural history of their animals. If you're working with Spilotes sulphureus, they're visually oriented. It's going to scare them to not be able to, all of a sudden a shadow's in front of them because the tub's opaque and they don't recognize you. They don't see that it's the keeper, whereas the boas, they're not visually oriented. So all of a sudden this heat signature being kind of diffused, I think helps them. And you can still do a lot with it. So I think there's a place for the professional breeders. I think there's a place for hobbyist breeders. And I'm glad to see like that TC Houston episode's a great example of him. He's basically arguing for hobbyist breeders being a big thing and people supporting that. And I think that is critical. But I also, and I don't want anyone to think I'm saying professional breeders are doing this wrong because they're not. To the extent that they're not telling people, no, you have to keep it the same way.
Right.
But Roy, you mentioned an interesting thing. When you look at people who are doing, let's say, a single rack animal, the tendency in this hobby with the proliferation of racks in any sort of environment where you can't see or interact with the animal, you get three things that become the big part of the hobby and which is huge in snakes. First is buying them, feeding them, and breeding them. Those are the three behaviors people who keep animals in racks get most of. So what do you see? Huge collections because people buy them, fat snakes because people want to feed them because that's the time they pull them out. And alternatively, you see a heavy emphasis in the hobby on celebrating breeding, but no other natural behaviors. Yeah. So, the more people get accustomed to the idea that hobbyist breeders don't necessarily have to keep the way the professional breeders do, and hobbyists don't have to keep like either of them do, the more we'll start seeing, I think, a celebration of just understanding and seeing more natural behavior because the environments that they'll be put in will exhibit more of those behaviors. And I don't expect every professional breeder to reach that that level of care. They're not going to be able to, or every snake that we want might go from $200 to $1,000 just because they all of a sudden, if they can only breed 20% of them in the same amount of space, that animal's gone up 5 times the price. That's how this works, So I think it's nice to have that range, and I would like to see more of that range without pressure from the professional breeders pushing down. And I'd also like for a little more grace to be given by the hobbyists who constantly attack these professional breeders for not exhibiting the same amount of care that they're going to give their 2 animals for 200. And this is setting aside people who are blatantly abusing these animals. There's been a guy who's been exposed for his reticulated python care. That's a no-go. That's inexcusable. I'm talking quality care, but not at the expense of the animal, but more simple. And there's an economy of scale to it. So that's kind of, I think, one of the first things that we could learn a lot from the aquarium hobby is no one expects a professional breeder who's doing it in ponds to separate out pairs. No one expects a hobbyist breeder who's got, no substrate on the bottom to, why doesn't it have a substrate that it can root in? It's just not, it doesn't make sense because they got 75 aquariums. Like you don't like that this fish is $10. The fish is completely fine in that environment. So there's got to be some grace given, and there's got to be less of a push to make everything homogenous in terms of care. So
love it. What else? So what next? There's that concept we've explored, and we're already cruising up on almost 2 hours already. So, which is fine with me.
Go fast then.
but I want to be respectful of your time, and I feel like already it's obvious that we're going to have you back to talk about this stuff more. But I'm also not trying to close this right now. I just want to note that we're cruising. So
well, do you guys have a preference in terms of topic? I don't know if you're looking at this, but there's a few I'd like. I think bioactive, the term bioactive, naturalistic is another one.
I'd love to get into that. Yeah. Let's talk bioactive.
Yeah. So bioactive as a term. So let's take the aquarium side definition of bioactive. So it doesn't matter if it's fresh or saltwater. The concept of a bioactive environment for freshwater, let's take, is you've got beneficial, there's obviously negative bacteria, but there's beneficial bacteria in all aquariums that cover all surfaces that effectively break down waste. And the way that they do this is they take the waste or the ammonia excreted by the fish and they break it down in what they call the nitrogen cycle. It takes it from extremely toxic ammonia to still toxic but less toxic nitrite with an I, to end product, which is nitrate. Nitrate in high amounts can still be toxic. So that's why you do a water change, right? And when you look at filtration for aquariums, it's 3 parts. It's chemical, to change. So people don't like yellow in their aquariums, so they do a chemical. Then they do physical to get out large debris. And then they do biological, which basically all it is a large surface area to be able to grow these bacteria. Right. And when you can tell an aquarium has been stabilized is when the bacterial load can manage the fish waste to the point where you're not seeing more ammonia or nitrite with an I than you are nitrate. That's the end result. That is all bioactive means, right? It doesn't matter if you've got snails in the aquarium. It doesn't matter if you've got crabs. It doesn't matter about any of this. It doesn't matter what the surface is as bacteria colonize. It could be a fucking piece of concrete, that's been sealed. It could be, it can be a live rock. It does not matter. That's what bioactive in terms of aquariums mean. And I think that's important because for some reason, the reptile hobby has started conflating some of the other aspects with the term bioactive. So Philippe de Vosgely has an unbelievably good chapter about the term bioactive in The Art of Keeping Snakes. Yeah. And he basically says the same thing. A deep substrate layer will process waste up to the point it can. No one expects, your sulfurious to be able to just eat 4 times a week and the soil is going to magically clean it, right? You go in and you get it out, but it can process a lot of that waste. That is bioactivity. There's bacteria in the soil. For some reason, I see a lot online where people say, well, my tank's not bioactive because I don't have springtails or I don't have isopods. And I would suggest that we break that down into the cleanup crew concept. Like when you're going to get in a saltwater aquarium, First step is you make sure it's bioactive. A lot of times they use what's called live rock, and I used to get this all the time. The rock's live, and I'm like, yes, but I mean, there's bacteria in it that can keep the fish alive, right? You put that in there, then you get a cleanup crew. The equivalent would be the springtails, the isopods, et cetera. You don't need the cleanup crew, but it makes your life easier because they eat some of the waste. So I think this is a concept that we need to parse more in reptiles, because I think they took that concept from aquariums without understanding the nuance and the distinction. So, I would like to see when people say bioactive, they mean it's got a deep substrate. It's, it's mature. It's been there long enough. The plants are, established if you're doing plants, et cetera, but you don't need any of that. So I would say for anyone listening to bear that in mind. If you like cleanup crews, that's awesome. It doesn't mean your aquarium, your terrarium's bioactive, because if you take it and you throw them in the substrate layers half an inch deep, your tank's not bioactive. You just got a cleanup crew in a terrarium that's probably not going to be able to process waste on its own, right? So those concepts, I think, are important to kind of differentiate between. And I think it's just an age thing, getting used to the idea and the terms. So I would like to, that's, I think, one of the more important topics, and it kind of goes into what's the next one, which is naturalistic. But I don't know if y'all have any comments on the bioactive part in general.
I love that. I mean, I think that, yeah, again, it's that substrate layer, the depth, the volume of substrate is such an important factor. And I do very minimal, basically I do no spot cleaning of my big Spilotes biotope. And I say that to people and they're like, that's crazy, because there's 3 of them in this space, but I have a literal truckload of soil in that vivarium. I'm not joking. Like when I moved the last time, I'm getting ready to do it again. The last time I did it, I was shoveling substrate out of this enclosure and literally got to the point where I had filled our pickup bed with substrate. And I didn't even know how that was possible. I was like, I don't remember putting this much substrate in there, but that's how much was in there, from leaf mold breaking down over time and me adding substrate here and there and stuff like that. But I think that was the main factor of it being able to do that without becoming a nasty, overloaded system. It's just that the sheer volume of substrate that was in there was so great. And, I think I see that more and more on Facebook, that people are talking about the concept of I hear people calling it simple bioactive, which is just, exactly what you're describing. It's just the lack of a cleanup crew.
But that's because the hobbyist could, for some reason, herpetoculture has conflated a cleanup crew with bioactive. So people were using a derivative term for something that really didn't need a derivative term at all. And that's, I think, cleaning up the terminology makes a big difference, because you guys will have guests on, and the old time, the old school guys, they hear, they have been doing this long enough, and they are smart enough to understand that not having a cleanup crew does not mean it's bioactive. So you got these new keepers who are coming in, and the older guys are like, oh, my tank's not bioactive. I don't have springtails, or I don't have isopods. And it's created a tension based on a misunderstanding of the initial language used. And so I think, we could eliminate attention without having to resort to an argument by just cleaning up the terms, which is the easiest thing in the world. And yeah, your Spilotes is a great example, because you've got them basically over a compost pile. That's just what that is.
What it is. Yeah.
Easiest way in the world. And so I would propose that. I think that's a relatively minor change to language that can have major impacts on the way that generations of the hobby communicate.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious where you were headed with naturalistic.
Yeah.
This is another one that gets me, because I see the term naturalistic, and man, there's a few things. So Roy used the term biotope, which is pretty much a direct lift from the aquarium hobby. So there is a movement now in aquariums to mimic what they basically do. Is there's a group called the BAP, it's Biotope Aquarium Project, and they basically created a competition. And What they do is you go and you create these aquariums where you mimic as close as possible an area. And the area could be as big as doing Amazon basin, or as simple or as specific as saying, I'm doing the upper part of the Ryu Shingu, like where you're talking a very specific area. They take pictures, they reference it, they use all materials that come from the area, all the plants, they use fish from the environment. I mean, they're obviously not importing substrate, but you mimic it as close as possible, and you call that a biotope, which, in a lot of ways, I'm glad that you had at least one guest on. I can't remember his Instagram handle, but he's a dude doing African colubrids, and I think they're colubrids, and he was talking about doing African plants as well. And, it's the same concept. Oh. There's some people.
Connor Jones.
Yeah, Connor Jones. So Connor's doing something really cool. And, some people in the biotope world believe that using the same sort of materials that the animals are used to will, kind of help along. Then you have naturalistic in the positive way, which to me is you have taken the basic concepts of the animal's care and you have done something similar. So a great example in the aquarium hobby, everyone who has an Instagram or something is going to see this. You guys ever seen those those aquariums with these beautiful planted aquariums, and they might have a rock, and it's just they're fucking stunning. But the main fish that they use in those, the ones they're called cardinal tetras. They have a blue stripe and a red stripe. They're tiny little schooling fish. Everyone, if you think of one of those in tanks, it's normally, they call it Iwagumi style, which has these rocks and it's flowing, and they have those fish. That cannot be further from what those fish are actually experiencing in the wild. Those fish are black water fish. What that means is that the water it's super low pH, extremely dark tint. It's clear, but it's dark, because it's got the tannins in it. That to me is a good example of what naturalistic, but not a biotope would be. The animals still thrive because you're using natural substrates and everything, and you see some benefit to that. Additionally, the other side of that, though, is you will see people, especially in the reptile hobby, who will call their enclosure naturalistic without realizing it looks absolutely nothing like what those animals are going to experience where they're from. It's an extreme example. Like, I've seen people who put Cali Kings in environments that I'm like, man, my tree bow is a little fit in perfectly there. Like, it doesn't make sense. So the concept, I think, has become conflated, and there needs to be kind of a push towards either you do the biotope natural history, or you accept that naturalistic does not have to be, even natural materials. Again, with aquariums, skull and a little treasure chest to a lot, those fulfill a lot of the basic needs of the fish that are hiding, right? Like, that fish doesn't care if it's a terracotta pot or if it's a skull or if it's a coconut pod or something that it would normally see. So, it's like, Phil, when you talk about your enclosures, I would consider that based on the way that we talk about them in aquariums. Even if you were using concrete blocks, I would consider them naturalistic, because at the end of the day, you are fulfilling all of the requirements of the animal, and you are doing a better job than if you were to take all natural materials and put those Euros in an environment that looks like Brazil. Yeah. And if everything was perfect. So I think the term naturalistic needs to be refined in the reptile hobby to kind of separate out. Biotope is its own thing because it's got a very specific definition. But I think naturalistic needs to be using natural materials, using artificial materials to mimic natural. And then there needs to be people who are cleaning up the idea that natural materials is always good, which is not always true. So but again, those terms have been around a lot longer in aquariums, so you see much more people used to using them in the ways that I'm kind of explaining now.
Yeah, no, I love this. So I recently made a change here. I donated my adult pair of Egyptian Euromastics to Ty Park down in Florida. And
nice.
Yeah. And I made this decision for various reasons. And I'm going to bring this back to what you were just talking about with naturalistic here in a moment. I promise. Part of why I did it was related to a lot of misgivings around breeding such a large species of lizard, I was getting increasingly uncomfortable with the absolutely minuscule number of people who I have sold those babies to, who continue to keep them. And the fact that it's very, very difficult. I mean, that you don't see anybody keeping those animals the way they need to be kept. You know, even my enclosures, which were 8.5 by 5.5 foot pens, or 8.5 by 5 foot pens rather, they didn't feel large enough at all. They're huge. They're huge animals. They're huge. And partially because of a lot of the conversations we've had on the show, and partially just because of feeling weird about producing those offspring, I decided to really put my money where my mouth is and send the animals to a place where they're going to get more space. They're going to get more of what they need to thrive as large lizards. You know, and I won't have the burden of producing those babies and offering them for sale and feeling the weird, you know, ethical quandary around that. Now, I didn't even want to bring it up on the show, but I chose to because of Jeremy Thompson, who knows that I did that, and Ty shared it on a post on his Instagram, and that's great and everything. But I had, you know, sort of my misgiving, you know, I had my hesitancies around mentioning it, but Jeremy really pushed me to do so because he felt like it was a really good decision and he felt like I should talk about it on the show. And so there you go, Jeremy. I'm talking about it publicly. But as a result, one of the things that I got to do is I got to take these huge pens, and I had two huge pens, and I'm like, what the fuck do I do with this? You know, and one possibility was going to be to chop them up into smaller pens and say, all right, let's put some other ornates here. What I ended up doing instead was setting up one of them for a single adult male Eurymastix, ornate Eurymastix. And I cleaned out the cage and I filled it with gravel, and I've been adding rock after rock after rock. So that way this is effectively a cliffside in Israel, you know? And I'm going to be using this as an experiment in various ways of keeping Eurymastix in a naturalistic way. And what I mean by that is I'm trying to put to the test a lot of things that people have talked about with Eurymastix that I've never actually seen anybody put to the test, right? So there's this long-standing idea that if you house lizards, if you give them multiple hiding places and lots of visual barriers and multiple basking zones, then they're going to do better in a communal setup in the first place. It's like, well, if you do that in a 6-foot enclosure, that doesn't mean anything. Like if, you know, like a 6x2, those multiple basking sites don't mean shit to the animal, right? If you don't have enough space to put like a fucking boulder in between one lizard and another, it doesn't matter. They're going to find each other. I've put multiple Eurymastix in enclosures before, full of crevices and you name it, and they find each other. They terrorize one another. And so this is an effort to see what happens when they have that much space and they have that much ability to get away from one another. There's quite literally numerous basking zones in the same enclosure that have no visual. There's no way one animal sitting on one enclosure or one basking zone could see an animal at the other basking zone. They just can't, right? And I feel like this is sort of just what you were saying about the naturalistic keeping, you know, just sort of feels like that's really what this was all about. This was a way of saying, all right, what happens when you do some of these things that nobody does? Nobody gives one animal that much space. And yeah, it's changing everything. Anyway, I don't really know where I was headed with this. I kind of lost my train of thought. I apologize. I'm sorry. I can't remember where I was going with this, but I had somewhere I was headed, and it's gone. It's gone. My bad. It'll come back to me, I'm sure.
Yeah, I appreciate.
I mean, you know.
Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
No, all you, man, all you.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I just appreciate just this like clarifying of these terms, because this is something that often, like I feel similarly. It's just like I see them misused all the time, and like I love that you're noting that Phil's setups are naturalistic.
Thank you.
Yeah, because it's like it also makes me think about like how it relates to process and like function. Like naturalistic is like supporting like natural function, in this animal, and natural processes in this animal. Is some way that I think that it helps to kind of distinguish it for me. But
yeah, and I appreciate the desire to nail down on terminology as well, just for a whole host of different reasons. We so many of these things just pop up and sort of have like a mimetic. They're just mimetic in a way where people will, you hear one term or one idea in a forum somewhere on Facebook, and it just spreads like wildfire. And all of a sudden, everyone's talking about it with the same terminology and with the same, everyone assumes it's the same definition and the same purpose. And it's like, dude, that is not what that God did. That's not what that means. There's no, like that's not what it is. And there's reasons why you want clarity around your nomenclature. There's a utility in that clarity and the discipline that comes around a well-defined set of terms that you're using in a given space. So I have a great appreciation for that, and I like that you're bringing it up because I don't know. I just don't hear a whole lot of people talking about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, well, and the thing is it would be a different situation if the reptile hobby took a term and created a new meaning for it, right? Language evolves. That's not an issue. The problem is you can tell it's like a bastardization of the term, and then it's being weaponized and used on people. Like this isn't naturalistic. Like, yes, it is. The distinction to me is between biotope or naturalistic, but not in the granular part of naturalistic. I think is where the issue is, and that weaponization is just causing an issue because a lot of the older generation understand this inherently. They see it, they look at it, and they say, "Well, my animal's exhibiting all the behaviors. Why does it matter if my Eurymastix is basking on top of a concrete block instead of a rock? It doesn't matter." And exhibiting behaviors like that is just, it's going to come either way. So, again, I think what I would really like to see is people who are interested in true naturalistic enclosures and reptiles start doing biotopes, and there's a lot to be said for that because it really, really connects you in terms of the natural history to the area where your animals come from, because you have to do a lot of research to be able to say, okay, these bromeliads are from the guy on a shield, and so I'm going to look at these. I now have to understand plants. I now have to be able to do X, Y, and Z, right? So you get a lot of that natural history, and it helps you learn where the animals are from in a better way. And that's kind of the educational component of what the Biotope Aquarium Project was talking about. It's an education thing, and it's what's really cool and what I really like about the biotope stuff is when you see people in other countries do biotopes of things that are local to you.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hey, can you get acacia trees? Is that a thing you can buy in the United States? Can you buy acacia trees? Because if I can buy a 5-foot acacia tree, I will put that in that damn ornate's pen.
You can definitely buy some acacia. I don't know about the same species, but
thanks for nothing, Roy. No, just kidding. I'm just playing around.
You probably can. I mean, I've like gone down the freaking rabbit hole trying to find plants from the same places of the stuff I keep, and I've been surprised at what I can find out there, especially because like I feel like COVID in some way has even helped that because so many people went nuts with plants during COVID that like suddenly there was just like a lot more showing up on like random places like eBay and Etsy and stuff. You'll just find these like random rare plants that I couldn't find a couple of years ago are now just like totally common.
Yeah, I mean,
But that's kind of the point, though, is think about how many people keep Guyana Shield animals. If all of a sudden everyone bromeliads from that area, there's going to be a market for it.
Oh, totally.
So the point is these movements can create momentum. But you can't really create the momentum if you're constantly arguing with people, about a term that you aren't using correctly, So I would just like to see it go back to, okay, I think biotope's a great example, or we accept the naturalistic doesn't necessarily mean there's a difference between a boulder and a concrete block as far as the animal's behavior. Aesthetically, there might be a difference, and you're allowed to have aesthetic preferences, but that doesn't mean you beat people over the head with it. That's kind of what I think of.
I've had...
Say it louder, man.
Yeah, and I've had more than one person comment on either my Facebook or my Instagram or any of my photos, just giving me shit, so much shit. It's like, all you did was just pile a bunch of rocks and sticks in there. And I'm like, yeah. Have you seen the desert where ornates come from? It's a fucking pile of rocks and sticks. Like it's
so uncreative, Phil, and just
roofing tiles. How could you? Wow, right? But I get it, right? But I also think there's another point in here, which is, we mentioned Connor, and I feel like he is an interesting fellow for various reasons. Really great guy, and I have a lot of respect for Connor. I think that, and you said it, Jamie, that individuals like him who are going so far as to house plants, like native to wherever the native range of the animal that they're keeping in the same enclosure, you're learning more about the natural history. Like when Roy puts those damn plants that has those little berries on them, and his stupid little monkey lizards ate these stupid little berries in his. I'm just being a smartass, but like that teaches you something about what you're doing and about, and, I made a post on one of my pages about utilizing wild photography of whatever it is that you're keeping. And I feel like that's sort of a similar thing, right? Like, another thing is like visiting the country and habitat of origin of your animal. Another thing could even, you could say that learning about the sort of evolutionary history of agamids is like a similar kind of thing to do, right? Like learning that uromastics and butterfly agamas, Laeolepis are have like a shared evolutionary history, and tracking their migration across Asia into the Mideast and then into North Africa. Oh, okay. What you're doing is you are enriching the resources from which you can draw upon to provide for the animals in your care in some way, right? And you have very direct ways of doing that, which is putting this stupid ass plant from the Guyana Shield that makes these dumb berries that these stupid little lizards eat in your stupid cage. I'm just kidding. And then you have, that's a very direct way of doing it. And then, you have like very indirect ways of doing it too, which is putting a stupid roofing tile in with your stupid desert lizard, right? And it's a little less direct. It's less. Anyway, I think that's highly cool. It's really interesting to me the way in which all of this stuff, like the diversity of ways that we can provide for our animals. I mean, it's just fucking awesome. It's great.
But there's a good point on both spectrums for that. Like, so take, for example, the berry thing, right? Let's say the first people that kept Bleakrus kept them with the berries and they eat the berries, right? They might tell the next group they have to have the berries.
Right.
And it turns out you don't. But the only way is if either side does it. You can't know if the Euros actually need a boulder versus a roofing tile unless you try both methods. So the experimentation, I think, gets kind of poo-pooed in the hobby, but that's really the best way to do it. If you, especially when you're working with new stuff, but for the most part, if you're bringing in something that's wild caught, the easiest way to acclimate it, frankly, is to put it in an environment where it recognizes things. So, if you got a wild caught polychris and it's in with a bunch of bromeliads or something that it recognizes, it's going to feel more at home. So you got to work from either end of the spectrum, depending on what the animals you're working with are and how long they've been in captivity, those individuals and the species themselves. But yeah, I think there's value to doing both ways to learn the extent. It might be something as simple as just understanding how much change this species or genus can tolerate before there becomes a problem. That in itself is one of the most valuable things we could learn, especially for people who sell these animals. Because how are you going to sell an animal you don't actually know the parameters of? What if someone's going to put a roofing tile in, and they ask you and you say, I don't know. The only way I've ever done it is biotope. That is one issue. The other issue is if they say, hey, I want to do a biotope and you can't, and they go, what kind of plants come in there? And you go, I don't know. I use, fucking plastic vines from Walmart. It's like it's nice to have people who have done both, so that you can get different experiences.
Yeah. And you said it best there about experimentation too. Like somebody has to be willing to take the leap and give it a try. They have to. I mean, especially with, we were just talking about these stupid sandfish and these stupid Schneider skinks. I don't know why I'm calling them stupid. They're not. They're awesome. I'm just saying, these are animals that very, very few people have kept long-term and even fewer people have bred, if any, with regard to the sandfish anyway. And it's like, if you don't try things, how the fuck are you even going to figure, how are you going to do anything? You can't, if we're all going to agree that if you do the same thing over and over and expect different results, then you're technically insane. If you don't want to be insane, you've got to try something else. You have to, I don't want to be insane. I'm not interested in it. Right? You have to try something else. Now, it doesn't mean see what happens when you throw 100 ornate Uromastics into a Guyana Shield biotope. That's not the kind of experimentation that I'm talking about. I'm talking about informed experimentation.
Yeah.
I think that's super useful. And people are really afraid of that. People are really afraid of it. And I'm sure part of it is just total well-meaning care. You're like, oh, I don't want to mess something up and make the animal sick or hurt them or anything, which is totally fair. Right. But then some people, they don't want to do it because they're like afraid that they're going to get called out. Like if I go, there's this huge Uromastics group on Facebook that it's a great group. And I commend the admins of the group because it's like 23,000 people strong. And it's like 6 people that are trying to keep this group managed and trying to keep tabs on everything. And I mean, it's crazy. Like it's insane what work the admins in that group do. That being said, they perpetuate stuff that I don't agree with at all, saying it's harmful to soak your Uromastics. I'm like, that's bullshit. Saying that, we don't condone hybrids in this group. It's like, well, that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself, hybridization, which is, a different thing. Oh, well, we don't feed insects to Uromastics. It's like, well, I do, just for the record. And in the last year and a half, it's changed a lot. I'm given a lot of bugs. So, oh no, oh God. I mean, how could I, right? It's people are afraid to take these leaps and experiment and try new things. Or people are afraid to experiment with things that were once that they're old now, but by doing it again, it's new. When Uromastics first came into the trade, people were feeding them bugs all the time. And then, the trade moved away from it. And now I'm moving back towards it because I'm seeing some utility there. Right. And you have to be able to you have to be able to try new things and, go for broke and try something weird. And again, that doesn't mean going insane, but you also have to not go insane. I don't know. Okay. All right. Guy, you got it. Yeah. Okay. that was a dumb joke. So we're at 2 hours.
Yeah, we are.
I'm so psyched about this. This is a great convo. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I'm not trying to say we need to stop right now, but this is great. Jamie, you've brought up so many interesting points and perspectives, and I don't think I knew what to expect from our conversation here today. But it's awesome. I'm floored by the insight that you bring to the table from a world that I don't understand at all. My mom kept a 300-gallon marine community tank that I watched her make, and it was great, and it was a good time. And I know, like, I have maybe a very rudimentary understanding of what's going on in that world, and from that and from my marine biology course in high school. But it's an admirable thing. They say, speaking of tangents, I read this really interesting book that was about innovation and the ways that some of sort of like the bold moves that various companies in history have taken to sort of like be on the cutting edge of what they're doing. And one of them sort of famously is like 3M. And 3M has this policy of like rotating their engineers every 3 to 5 years from one department to another. And some of that is because when you take someone who has sort of an expertise in one area, and then you bring them into this other area, there's ways in which they naturally kind of plug and play and say, all right, like, what do I already have that's going to like work here and work here? And sometimes, most of the time, you get nothing, right? You don't get there's nothing that happens. There's no connections. But every now and again, you get somebody who is working in adhesives, and you put them in this other thing, and you get the sticky note, and you get something really badass and really cool. So I love that you're bringing this sort of like edge perspective, like this almost like a blended perspective between the aquarium hobby and herpetoculture in a way that is also really intellectual. So I like very much appreciate your thoughts here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And I mean, it's, as we discussed prior to, I think, recording, I bred dart frogs, keeping them damn near exactly like we did fish. Like we would cool them slightly because they're from the exact same environment of the fish. You warm them up slightly with the house, and then you feed them a shitload of live food. The females bulk and they breed. It's the exact same way we did it with fish. So there is a lot of overlap, but And I'm glad we at least covered about half the topics, because that means someone will actually have to read my article to get the rest. But I appreciate the time, and I just think it's an interesting thing to I'm in a position where I wouldn't expect to be able to contribute in terms of breeding to herpetoculture. I don't think that's going to be my niche in this. I'm not going to be a professional breeder. I like the animals. I love keeping them. And maybe one day I'll do something like that. But I think everyone listening who has a unique perspective can add something. And I just hope, whether if someone's, raised farm animals, you can learn a lot from that, even if it's something as simple as understanding veterinary medicine better than what people in the reptile hobby do, which is a very sore spot for a lot of people, because the reptile hobby just is weak on that. So someone who's got experience with that might be a critical resource for that. Being able to keep fish is a different skill, but I think there's value to branching out, like you said. And if anyone's interested in aquariums, I think they should consider it, because I do think it makes you a better reptile keeper depending on how you keep aquariums.
Well, yeah. Sorry, Roy. I apologize if I'm cutting you off here. That's also true. Excuse me. If you're someone like me who pretty much just keeps lizards and mostly one kind of lizard. Last year I got these godforsaken hingeback tortoises, and I love them to death. They're so funny, but they have been the steepest fucking learning curve for me. It's been so challenging. Like, I don't know why. I don't know what it is, but it's so far outside my comfort zone. Maybe it's only a little bit outside my comfort zone, but I tend to stick into it so much that it feels way more outside that zone for me. Like, I can't even imagine going through the steps of setting up maybe I can imagine it, but it's a highly daunting task for me to envision setting up some beautiful freshwater aquarium somewhere. I mean, I should do it. I really should just do it. I'd like to get that learn on, but it's daunting. I'm terrified. Help. What do I do?
Yeah, that could be part 2. Here's how to do it.
Indeed. Part 2. Well, so Roy, do you think now's the time for that closer question? How are you feeling, man? What's the word over there?
Yeah, I think we should move in that direction. I think it makes sense.
Okay.
I also just feel stoked and enlivened about this conversation, and definitely want to take it further in the future. So
yeah,
and I'm excited. I'm excited for the rest of the article as well.
Yeah, you have to flesh that thing out all the way, and you have to.
Yeah, I will, because I mean, it's funny. The rest of the topics are more theoretical, just stuff that I think could have application, but it hasn't been really discussed. Whereas these were much more of term understanding and kind of comparison. So yeah, it'll be fun. It's a new project, at least, Yeah.
And I really love what you said too, just about finding your unique contribution, and in offering it. I think that's something I see so much. And you spoke to it earlier too, about just we tend to really celebrate the breeders in herpetoculture as these are the, this is what it's all about and everything. But honestly, a lot of the people I'm most inspired by in herpetoculture are not necessarily focused on breeding their animals at all, but they're just doing interesting things or thinking about it in interesting ways. And, some of them don't even have any herps at all right now, but they're still engaging with the community and offering a lot of insight and good questions. And it's just there's so much, I don't know, I just feel there's so much opportunity and ripeness within herpetoculture right now for progression and for really elevating it and taking it to another level. And so I'm stoked to be seeing that happening. I feel we're moving in that direction. As long as we can keep it at all, I think that we're going to get something pretty cool. So maybe so.
Yeah, as a Floridian, I feel that pain.
Yeah,
we're getting hit pretty hard. So in terms of what we can and can't keep, and it's the frog in the boiling water. It's just slowly getting ramped. So we'll see. You might be getting those Egyptian Eurymasics back, Phil.
That would be such a drag if that happened. I mean, I would take them back. That's fine. I'm happy with them, but still. Anyway, sorry. Getting off on it here.
Cool. Well, I feel part of me wants to ask what would you like to see more of in herpetoculture? And I feel we've kind of already been exploring that, but just maybe to kind of, if you could offer your summary of what would you like to see more of? What would you like to see happening in that space?
We talked a lot about corrective language, but it's interesting because, I've gone to, like I said, I've been to Daytona 25 straight years, pretty much. I've seen the progression in terms of the hobby, and people have said, oh, well, the ball pythons crushed everything when they came in, and, and now it's hognose and crested geckos. What I'd like to see more of, and what we've discussed, and what I think is really, really cool, and what y'all have done a great job of, is the hobbyist breeder. It's people who aren't reliant financially on having a large collection, who can come in and start working with animals that are done differently, and experimenting with them. Because again, the hobbyist breeder in a lot of ways is in such a great position, because when you're not financially tied to something, you can experiment in a way that's very difficult for someone whose livelihood relies on this to actually do it, So I would like to see more of that. I would like to see from professional breeders, again, I would like to see them understand what the end result of most of these animals is going to be, and try to work towards keeping their animals at least to the extent that they can survive in these conditions and hopefully thrive. And I would like to see the new hobbyists understand, and I said, give grace earlier, but I would like to see them understand that these professional breeders are required for the hobby, and I probably the biggest thing that I would like to see more of is I think we forget that in general, we're kind of in like our own little world. And you see a lot of people put down people in the reptile hobby. And I just don't get it, because like, say I came out today and said, I've cracked the code on breeding Boelen's pythons, like everyone in the hobby, there's going to be people who say that guy doesn't know shit. There's going to be people who say congrats, but everyone outside the hobby, if I said that to them, their response is going to be, what do you mean they're breeding in the Everglades? They don't understand the difference between a Boelen's and a Burmese and a ball. So like, it doesn't make sense to me for people in the hobby to put down other people in the hobby, knowing that no one else is going to care. And so I would like to see more of that. I would like to see more positivity in terms of celebrating successes in all different ways. That means breeding, that means new behaviors, that means setting up biotopes and importing rare plants that are now, getting established. I'd like to see that just in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree with
that. On all of that. Yeah.
Well said. Wow. Damn, dude. That was like a mic drop moment. That was good.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad I asked you.
Yeah, me too. Good job, Roy.
All right. Well, why herpetoculture? I mean, it's coming. I feel like, again, we've been exploring this already, but for you personally, why?
I'm gonna change the article, but my intro to this is, I think it's, when I was a teenager, I brought in, and I was able to get basically these fish called Siamese tigerfish. They're stunning. They're these big gold black barred fish. They're great, and I had 3 of them. And at the time being, at the time I was told they're impossible to breed. There was like third-hand reports they were being bred in Asia. It was pretty obvious that they were just, the third-hand reports were covering up the fact that these animals were endangered to critically endangered, and they were just getting brought in regardless. What's up?
These things are crazy looking. Sorry.
Yeah. No. This is, everyone should Google this fish. They're called Siamese tigerfish. Well, the one species that I had is far and away the rarest, but they were extremely coveted. So I managed to get in. I think I paid $1,000 for the 3, and this was in 2005. As a teenager, it was a shitload of money, but I never tried to breed them. I had 3 of them. They died during a hurricane. We lost power for like 9 days, and they died. Right. I never tried to breed them. Okay. I went looking for them 5 years ago, and I emailed a guy who I knew from a long time that brought in rare fish. And he told me, he said, there are still some in the hobby. They are critically endangered in nature. The ones that I've seen in the hobby are multi-thousands of dollars. And I proceeded to Google, start looking at reports, critically endangered, basically fished them out for the aquarium hobby. And pollution in the area, which, as we know, as reptile keepers, those 2 things, palm oil plantation and the hobby. So they fished them out for the hobby, palm oil or pollution. That experience taught me everything I need to know. There are people coming into the fish hobby who will never, ever see that specific species of Siamese tiger in person. I saw 3 of them for sale recently for $5,000 a piece by that guy. So a $300 fish became a $5,000 fish, and they're still not being bred. Those 3 are probably 10 to 15 years old because they're still in the hobby. They might be beyond life, And so point being, if it's not us that do it, there is the very strong possibility with a lot of these animals, they will become endangered, they will get restricted, and then people, who come into the hobby are never going to be able to do it. So the why to the herpetoculture is because if it isn't us, there might not be a second chance. It's that simple.
Wow. Yeah. Shit. That said it.
Yeah. Thanks for that, man.
Yeah. Damn. Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody needs to go look at this fish.
Yeah. They're really cool. It's Datnioides pulcher. The pulcher is the one that I used to keep. There's a bunch of different types, but there's a lot of cool fish, and again, I encourage anyone who hears this episode and says, hell, I want to set up an aquarium to do it. I think it's great for everything.
Oh, man.
I might have to try it eventually.
I think you have
to. I said it. It's on record, so.
I'll have to check in and see.
Oh, definitely. You're who I'm going to be talking to about it. So just brace yourself.
Ready.
All right. Cool. Well, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out, get in touch, anything like that?
Let me check. My name is like the most generic shit in the world. Jamie Woods 573. JAMIE Woods 573 on Instagram. So feel free to shoot me a message, add me. I don't really have anything on there in terms of like the hobby, but that's about the only way.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, man. This was an amazing conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next one. Seriously, thanks again.
Sure thing, guys.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, man. It was a great conversation.
Had a good time.
I'm gonna hit the button.